it all began when I thought, as director of the European Council on European Studies, which embraces both all of Europe, Western Europe, all the way across to what used to be called Russia and Eastern Europe. It's still Eastern Europe, probably. It's ex-Soviet Union, but not ex-Eastern Europe. And so immediately came to my attention that Jan Gross's new book had just appeared this summer, and that he was a very important both scholar and voice in public debate these days, and it really was a good idea to invite him to come to Yale. So we went back and forth by email, and we troubled and brought our heads together. We found a date, we found a time, everything was set up, we arranged, we agreed, we have a wonderful administrator, everything was in the system, it was all sort of semi-online, emails were flying, and we know that we can't tell people about something too far in advance, so just as it's approaching the time, we start to advertise. Lo and behold, we get an email from another part of Yale University, the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. People would say this more precisely, saying on this very same day, at this very same time, we have invited Professor Antony Polonsky to speak on the subject of Jan Gross. This demonstrates, on the one hand, the essential chaos of Yale, and on the other hand, the essential reality of intelligent design. Someone up there organized two events at the same time on the same subject. And we, being more intelligent than the intelligent designer, decided, well, we will bring them together and have them talk to each other. And not surprisingly, given it was the same subject, they actually know each other and have talked with each other before in public, probably also in private. So that is the reason that there are two sponsors for this event, and the sponsor, the other half of the sponsors will introduce his half of the event, so to speak, so that we will all learn about this other part of Yale, which actually I know very little about myself. The format will be that the subject of today's discussion is provoked by the works of Jan Gross, Professor Gross, which we submitted, and the format will be that the discussant, Professor Polonsky, will initiate the event by speaking for 15 or 20 minutes, and then Professor Gross will then speak for another 15 minutes, and then they will be able to exchange ideas or reply to each other, or have some kind of exchange, dialogue, for however much it makes sense to have it. And then we will also open the floor to discussion and questions and remarks from the floor, keeping in mind that it's a dialogue, it's a discussion. So we want questions posed and back and forth. And at the center of attention for this afternoon's event is, in fact, I'm sure Professor Gross would be really upset if I said the center of attention left him, but I will say that the center of attention is his work. And Jan Gross is currently the Norman B. Tomlinson class of 1916 and 1948 Professor of War and Society at Princeton University. Before then, he has taught also at other institutions. Before then, he was at NYU, New York University. He's also taught at Emory, at Yale, and various other universities in Europe. Jan Gross came to the United States from Poland, from Warsaw in 1969, at a moment of political turmoil in Poland. And having lived in Poland, he thought that the best place to end up on the other side of the ocean was Yale. And he got then his PhD in sociology at Yale in 1975. His dissertation was then later published as a book, Polish Society Under German Occupation. It appeared in 1979 and was followed almost 10 years later by Revolution from Abroad. Now, these books in 1988, for a historian, I'm a historian of Russia, are really important books, not only for the information they bring to bear, but for the way they are written. This is a sociologist writing about history. He has a conceptual framework, and they are parallel books. There are books about the two different occupations of Poland under the Stalin-Hitler Pact, and it's an analysis of how these powers impinge and penetrate on the society that they are occupying. So they are a pair, they're twins, and they are a remarkable intellectual achievement, in my opinion, and a model for historians. I won't speak for sociologists. Anyway, they're very stimulating, and they are not argumentative, they are thought-provoking. However, the piece of writing and scholarship that by Professor Gross that has been the most provoking and thought-provoking and politically provoking is his book called Neighbors, which appeared in 2001. And here he examines, instead of a broad conceptual problem, a microcosm, a case study, in this case the horrible event during World War II in which the Jews of a certain town, Litvak, were murdered collectively by their own Polish neighbors. And although this had been known locally, it was not alone, it was not really publicized in Poland. And the publication of this book in English and in Polish, and the debate that it aroused, really started a whole public discussion in Poland. And it is not every historian, least of all every academic historian, who can say that he or she has intervened in the public debate in a really productive and important and historical way. So Litvak, and I'm sure this will come up in the discussion, is itself a historical event. However, the book that provoked me or inspired me to invite him on this occasion is his second book on in a similar format. And this book appeared only this summer. It is called Fear. And in this book, Professor Gross examines another atrocity, this time after the war. This time, the first atrocity occurred under the aegis of the Germans occupying. Here we have, after the war, the Germans are defeated. Jews are either returned to Poland or returned to their places of origin, and there is a, as we say in Russian history, a pogrom, in which, this is the famous Kielce pogrom, an event which is not unknown, but here light is shown upon it in great detail and in dimension, and there's an argument that emerges from this book. It has not yet been published in Polish. I don't know whether it has yet entered into Polish, also civic discourse. So young Gross is both, what we would all like to be sort of a part of our fantasy lives as historians, scholars, and serious engagement with the sources and problems of history, and also, to some extent, have an effect on how people think about the past and the present. And the theme that is engaged, of course, in this recent work is the relationship between Jews and Poles under the pressure of the war and the post-war period. And that is the format for today's discussion. And that is why these two discussants can sit together at the same table under the aegis of the Council on European Studies and the Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and talk about, I think on the occasion of this book, which is subtitled Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz. So it is my enormous pleasure to welcome Jan Gross and his interlocutor, Antony Polonsky, and turn the podium over to my colleague, Charles Small.
So thank you. So just a brief few words about the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism. For those who don't know about it, we were just launched in September. We run a seminar series, and we're going to be housing research projects and the sort. So for people who don't know about us, if you want to receive our emails, we send out emails regularly in a newsletter about issues of anti-Semitism, mostly contemporary anti-Semitism. I'd be happy to take your names down. So this is a new program. It's actually the first at a North American university that's focused on the interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism. So it's a great honor to be a part of this event, and I'll be very quick and brief. I would like to introduce to you Professor Polonsky. He is the Albert Abramson Professor of Holocaust Studies at Brandeis University. He also has an appointment at the Holocaust Museum of the United States. Professor Polonsky is an expert on the subject of Polish history and Polish-Jewish history in particular. I won't go into the amount of books and articles that he's written. Prolific writer. He recently just received a very prestigious award in Poland called the Felix Scharf Statuette, which is an award for scholars who are engaged in preserving the legacy of Polish-Jewish history. He's also edited a book dealing with the issue of neighbors, which Professor Gross wrote, called The Neighbors, a Response, where he has an edited volume of collected essays responding to the important works of Professor Gross. So it's really an honor to introduce Professor Polonsky.
Well, the center of today's discussion is obviously Jan Gross, and I feel a little embarrassed speaking first, but when I heard that we were both speaking on the same day, I felt that there was no way we could handle things like this except by doing it together. What we're looking at today is the question of Polish-Jewish relations and Polish-Jewish attempts at Polish-Jewish understanding. But this phrase, Polish-Jewish, in a way highlights what the problem is, because after all, Jews were citizens of Poland. And the problem was that in some sense the Jews were not considered as Poles. The two groups were separate. So what we should really be talking about is Poles of Jewish origin and Poles of Christian and agnostic origin. And maybe some groups fall in between. And of course there are also groups which can be seen as neither of these groups. Jan is an example of this. Jan has a very distinguished background. His grandfather was representative in the Austrian Reichsrat of the so-called Club of Progressive Jews, elected mostly by non-Jews in Krakow. His maternal grandfather was a very well-known criminal lawyer who defended Jews, but who was not himself Jewish. So he is a person who illustrates or combines these problems. So what I'd like to do in the very short period at my disposal, because I really would like to put you on the floor as well, is to look firstly at the way in which debates between Poles and Jews, terms which I'm not wholly comfortable, have developed. Then to look at the way in which these debates were transformed, firstly by the emergence of Jan's book Neighbours, and now by his new book Fear, which of course hasn't yet come out in Polish, so the debates are really at an early stage. And then finally to say something about the question of reception. That is to say, historians write essentially by the historians, but there is also a wider audience for which we all hope to reach. And I want to ask, how far has this debate reached a wider audience, particularly above all in Poland itself, but also outside Poland? Now, the central question in Polish Jewish, what divides Poles and Jews today is essentially the past, or different views of the past. There are some other issues, for instance, the issue of property restitution, private property restitution, but this is a less important issue, and although I'm not a particular sympathizer with the present Polish government, it does seem to be making some sort of an effort to deal with this issue, and this is, in my view, increasingly a marginal issue. So what really divides Poles and Jews is different views over the past, and particularly different views over the Second World War. The basic facts of what happened in Poland during the Second World War are clear. Poland was occupied by very brutal regimes, both from the East and the West, and the impact on Jewish life in Poland was disastrous. Of the 3.5 million Polish Jews on the eve of the Second World War, barely 350,000 survived the war. The rate of survival was lower than anywhere else except in the Baltic states. Now it's clear that the primary responsibility for the deaths of Jews in Poland during the war was caused by the Nazis, by the Nazi occupation, and by the brutal policy carried out by the Nazis, the implementation of the final solution. The reason that death camps were established in Poland was this was where the bulk of Jews were to be found. The reason why the major death camp was established in Oświęcim, in which most of the Jews who died were not only Polish Jews, but Hungarian and other Jews, was because this was a railway junction at the heart of the Nazi in Europe. Nevertheless, although it's clear that the Nazis were overwhelmingly responsible for what happened to the Jews, this does not still a sense of Jewish grievance and a sense of on the side of the Jews that the Poles did not behave during the Second World War in a manner that was expected. Just to give one quotation here, Emanuel Ringelblum, a diarist who was organizer of the underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, and wrote a book on the Aryan side called Polish-Jewish Relations during the Second World War. He wrote that the Polish government, people and the government of the Republic of Poland were incapable of deflecting the Nazi steamroller from its anti-Jewish course. But the question is permissible whether the attitude of the Polish people befitted the enormity of the calamities that befell the country's citizens. Was it inevitable that the Jews needed to hear laughter from wild mobs resounding from the other side of the ghetto walls? Did they really have to prevail such blank indifference in the face of the greatest tragedy of all time? I could repeat such statements. These are essentially accusations sensed of grievance, which is very easily understood given the terrible situation in which the Jews found themselves. Polish responses to these accusations have taken two forms. On the one hand, there have been attempts to justify Polish behavior and apologies for the behavior of Poles during the period. The best example of apologetics, I think, is an article written some years ago, 1987, by a veteran member of the opposition, Brandeis, in which essentially he argued that the situation of the Poles was such that they couldn't do significantly more in order to aid the Jews. The obvious example of the attempt to apologize for Polish behavior is the well-known essay written by young Polonsky in the same year, 1987, The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto, in which he argued that if only we had behaved more humanely in the past, had been wiser, more generous, then genocide would perhaps have been less imaginable, would probably have been considerably more difficult to carry out, and almost certainly would have met with much greater resistance than it did. To put it differently, it would not have met with the indifference and moral turpitude of the society in whose full view it took place. Now, in the 90s, the debates on Polish behavior really took place within the framework set by Polonsky and Chilenowitzki. People, on the one hand, argued that conditions were such that the Poles could have done very little more to aid the Jews. On the other, people talked about the indifference towards Jewish suffering and the fact that in the period before 39, Polish society had not created the conditions in which Jews could be part of Polish society, part of the Polish universe of obligation. And there were a series of debates during this period examining this. The debate, for instance, in Gazeta Wyborcza in 1994, when the young historian Michał Cichy discussed anti-Semitic activities on the part of insurgents during the Warsaw Uprising. It's an interesting comment on the present climate in Poland that Cichy has just written an apology to the insurgents, while repeating the same statements about what took place. Why he did this is an interesting question which we might discuss. Similarly, there was an important debate provoked by an exchange between Fathers Muszal and Krostowski about the reaction of the Polish hierarchy to the anti-Semitic utterances of Father Jankowski, and a series of debates provoked by an article by a Polish sociologist, Anna Schwider-Ziemba, in Gazeta Wyborcza. In the 80s, these debates were all essentially moral, and all essentially conducted by sociologists, anthropologists, and military critics rather than by historians. Two things changed in the 90s. First was the emergence of a group of Polish Jewish writers writing in Polish, most of them either living in Poland or who had left Poland in '68, who described their own experiences during the Second World War, living on the Aryan side. The most obvious example, I'm glad that Marcy Shaw is in the audience, is Michał Głowiński's Black Seasons. Marcy translated it as The Black Seasons, in my view the only defect in a very brilliant translation. But this describes very well the difficult situation of those Jews on the Aryan side, and in Polish, which spoke very much more effectively to Poles. There was also a much greater historical investigation of these topics. There was a vast mass of material which looked at the Polish-Jewish relationship, and it essentially came to the view, as Maria Janion, a Polish sociologist, wrote in Tygodnik Powszechny, that by 1939, the majority of Polish society and the Polish political parties had come to the position that the, in quotation marks, solution of the Jewish problem was the voluntary or compulsory removal of most Jews from Poland. Of course, there were a lot of people who didn't accept this. There's also the question of, faced with the actual implementation, how widely would these policies have been implemented. But that this was the case was wide, created was a consensus among historians, and created a new climate of opinion. And this was the context in which Jan's epoch-making book Neighbours, which was first published in Polish in 2000 and then in English in the following year, appeared. It's tempting to say to Klaus Young, with the same group of Polish Jews who came to write in the 1990s, with the Dichters and the new works of Henry Grinberg or the Black Seasons of Lewinsky. In a way, he's part of that same generation, although he left in '68. Now, the book, which is a short book, describes in brutal how the local population in this town of Jedwabne murdered the overwhelming majority of their Jewish neighbors. Almost the entire Jewish population, plus Jewish refugees from other localities, were driven out of their homes and murdered at the marketplace. Many were beaten to death with poles, brooms, and axes. Some were murdered at the Jewish cemetery. The vast majority were, about 700, burnt in a local bar. This the discussion of this was put together by Young on the basis of the court reports and also of the depositions which were to be found in the Jewish Historical Institute, and this provoked a very large debate in Poland. And this debate took place on two levels. I want to talk first about the historical debate and then about the reception, because the historical debate, in my view, in many ways, is the more promising debate and the more important debate. The problem of the issues involved in the debates really revolve around, can be summed up under three headings. Firstly, there are disagreements about what actually happened in Jedwabne. Secondly, there are differing contexts over the context of the massacre. And finally, there are arguments about its larger significance. And again, I have to summarize very quickly. I'm very eager to get Jan's response. The point, the arguments about what happened in Jedwabne revolve around a number of questions. How many Jews were murdered? How many Poles took part? How much German incitement was there? And there was a very important collection, a two-volume collection published by the Institute of National Memory, which deals with a lot of these questions and which I think pretty conclusively gives us most of the answers. If we start with how many Jews were murdered, I think Jan can argue on this point that the figure of 1,600 is probably too high. Of course, from a moral point of view, it is of no significance whether it's 900 or 1,600, but one wants to get this correct. There were several other such incidents in Vishna and in Rajivo, but the figure of 900 is perhaps more reliable, although we'll never know for sure. How many Poles took part? The Institute for National Memory showed that a very large proportion of the adult male population took part, and that those who did not were subsequently treated very badly by the population. Indeed, the two families which attempted to help Jews, the Jesuits in particular, were forced to leave the town. In fact, the last of the Jesuits, I assisted with his asylum application to the United States, which I'm happy to say was successful. Well, he got a green card. I mean, it's hard to seek asylum from Poland because he was given a green card, and he couldn't remain as a farmer there because of the local pressure. His father was one of the people who sheltered Shmuel. Now, let me move on to the larger issues. The larger issues are partly the question of how far was the massacre the result of the larger atmosphere, and secondly, how far was it the result of the Soviet occupation and the alleged Jewish collaboration with the Soviets. At the same time, there's also the context of the question. I mean, I won't say anything about these. I think that Jan argues it's the first rather than the second, and I think that by and large that is correct, although since he wrote a book on the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland, one could argue that the second had been dealt with elsewhere, and certainly was important, and the Soviets certainly widened, and were eager to widen the division between Poles and Jews. On the question of the implications or of the wider significance of the massacre, the fact is that what we're talking about here is firstly, the question of collective guilt. Now, Jan was accused by some of those who criticized his work of standing for or arguing for collective guilt. In fact, the passage at the end of the book where he says that the neighbors were, that the society was responsible, was an attack on the two monuments in the town which falsified the history. One monument which referred to the murder of the Jews and saying that they were murdered by the Germans, and another which referred to the members of the Wagner community who were killed, 180 odd, at the hands of the security forces, which was signed Society. Jan said to me in a discussion that he should have put society in inverted commas, which I think is true. The other two questions are questions which have come up in the discussion since, which are how widespread was anti-Semitism in Poland during the Second World War, and to what extent was the regime that was established in Poland after 1945 a regime controlled by by Jewish communists, and how far was it really a regime controlled by people who were compromised by their behavior during the Second World War. Jan has argued it's rather the second rather than the first. Let me now say something about the response to what happened. Certainly the debate on Lithuania has been the most serious, profound and protracted on any issue of Polish-Jewish relations since the end of the Second World War. And the initial responses of the President, Alexander Kwaśniewski, the then Prime Minister, Jerzy Buzek, and the then Foreign Minister, Władysław Bartoszewski, were entirely appropriate given the seriousness of the problems involved. The actions of the government in removing the monument which attributed the massacre to the Germans and proposing to replace it with a more appropriate one accompanied by a suitable ceremony were also impressive. The responses of the political leaders differ somewhat in tone, from Bartoszewski's explanation to an American audience of the steps that were going to be taken to investigate the massacre, to Kwaśniewski's moving attempt to come to terms with the difficult truth. At the commemoration service, which was held in Lithuania on the 60th anniversary of the massacre, Kwaśniewski observed, "We express our pain and shame, we give expression to our determination in seeking to learn the truth, our courage in overcoming an evil past, our unbending will for understanding and harmony. Because of this crime, we should beg the shadows of the dead and their families for forgiveness. Therefore, today, as a citizen and as a president of the Polish Republic, I apologize. I apologize in the name of those Poles whose conscience is moved by that crime." An interesting and serious qualification, but these were entirely appropriate. So too, with some qualifications, was the response of the Church, although the initial response of the Primate was somewhat more complicated. How far has this changed attitudes in Poland? Initially, I think one could be quite optimistic. Certainly, there was a widespread willingness to accept what had happened and a widespread willingness to come to terms with it. Recently, the situation has changed somewhat. And here, I mean, I'm not sure how the situation is, and I very much like to get Jan's response. But there are a number of new developments which I think need to be taken into account. Firstly, there is what one might call transition fatigue. 17 years since the end of communism, nearly 18 years since the end of communism in Poland. Many people are better off, but many people are not. And there is a sense of the question, why is this the case? Secondly, the fact is that Poles, one of the principal objectives of the Polish political elites, whether at the right or left, was to get admission to the European and international structures, NATO and the European Union. This required a certain sense of restraint and a sense of that is no longer the case because Poland is part of these structures. This enables people to speak more freely. There's also been a political change in Poland. The last post-communist government compromised itself by its corruption and its crony capitalism. It's very much discredited. The left has only about 13 or 14% of the vote in public opinion polls. The SLD is essentially self-destructive, and the right has come to power. This is not in itself a bad thing. The problem is that the right was divided, and in order to hold power, the present government has sought to win the support, and it has in its coalition several extreme right-wing parties. This has created a new climate of opinion, which is problematic. And you can see this in the reception of Jan's second book, which we'll discuss in due course. I haven't had time to say much about it. Firstly, there is now, there's been a debate in Poland about the nature of the transition in '89. Was this a rational compromise between two reasonable groups, or was this a sellout to the communists who are already weak? The second group is now This second view is now much more strongly advocated, and what you might call the neo-nationalist or neo-Ende group of historians is much stronger both in the Institute for National Memory and elsewhere. When the Institute for National Memory published its volume on 1968, which I think gives a pretty good account of 1968, the introduction, and he said the same on the radio, by a man called Jewry, one of these neo-Ende historians, said that we reserve the right to question whether there was actually a conspiracy behind what happened in Kielce, which I think is a very questionable issue. There is now a law on the statute which says that anybody who claims that Poland, or the Polish nation, collaborated with the Nazis or the Soviets, can be said is guilty of a crime for which the penalty is 3 years in jail. The whole question of getting rid of people with a communist past has taken a very nasty turn, the last aspect of which was the forced resignation of the Archbishop of Warsaw. On that occasion, very viciously anti-Semitic statements were made by the people at the church, and you can read these also in Nash agenda. So there is a certain transition fatigue, and it will be interesting to see how the response is to Jan's new book, which looks at the further development of anti-Semitism, and in particular one of its worst post-war manifestations. I think that while all of the things that I've described are true, what is also important, and with this I'll conclude, there has been a much greater scholarly base for the investigation of these events. I think that, for instance, the creation of the Center for Holocaust Studies in Warsaw is a very important development, and the journal which it's established is at a very high level. I think that one wants to separate the scholarly debate from the public reception. The public debates are generally politicized historical debates generally don't lead anywhere. I believe ultimately that with Pierre-Henri Lesage that facts are stubborn things, and that one needs to establish the facts and look at them carefully and clearly. The other aspects of this problem, coming to terms with the past, are much slower and will take place, but will take place in a different way. What is important is, above all, what is taking place at an elite level. That may be an overly optimistic position, but that is my view, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everything, for Laura's wonderful introduction and for the invitation to appear here, and for Antony's very thoughtful series of comments. Of course, almost every item, so to speak, on the long list of his observations would serve us as an introduction to a conversation by itself. So there is a whole bouquet of issues here, and I'll maybe respond to a few, and then we'll see what happens. And probably we will run out of time. As far as the one thing which I find to be very interesting, and it's an issue that really stretches very far back. To the period of the Second World War, and a kind of a manner in which the destruction of Polish Jewry has been processed, as it were, by the surrounding society. Processed, I mean by that, essentially recorded and then dealt with. But it starts then in the discussion that Antony presented. This issue of relationships between Poles and Jews reappears once again in 1980s and 90s, and then after the publication of Neighbors, the big question before us is what do we attribute to the fact that these issues suddenly come up finally, and then that they are taken and attention is focused on them and they are discussed. In 1980s, and I think the statement from Antony is very good and important here. The article that was published in Tygodnik Powszechny, a wonderful Catholic publication of Krakow by Jan Błoński, really triggered an enormous amount of this early interest and focused conversation on the issue of Polish-Jewish relations. And by today's standards, it was, of course, very tame, but significant. And Antony failed to mention, but what happened at the time was also a kind of an opening up of this dialogue within conferences of scholars. We participated in several of those. And there were scholars from Israel, from America, from Poland that started meeting in various sites in Oxford, in Jerusalem. There was a very important meeting. One of the very important publications that came out of it was a collection, a wonderful volume that Antony edited with Polonsky's article and then a series of responses to it, and it came out in English. Really, there was a kind of a coming of minds, so to speak. This is a time also where an incredibly important and moving documentary film has been made about the Kielce pogrom by Marcel Łoziński, which is called The Witnesses, in 1987. It was shown at one of these conferences. Let me say that at the same, so this was the focus of attention in a fairly small, narrow milieu of scholars, and moved the discussion considerably. I was part at the time of an Émigré initiative which started among, at the time, younger people who left in 1968, following the events of 1968 from Poland. We started a periodical which was called Annex. It was coming out for a number of years, first in Sweden, then in London. And it was a kind of a lame, parallel, very modest statement that went along the same track that this formidable publication of Kultura by Giedroyć first established. And one of the issues that we have published, it was actually before Polonsky's death, was devoted to the discussion of the subject of Polish-Jewish relations. Several articles were written there. I wrote a piece which later on would appear in a book form as well. And a very important text was written also by the editor of the journal at the time, Alexander Smolar, who later on played a very important political role. In fact, sort of returned after 1989 with at least one leg to Poland, divided his time between Paris and Warsaw, and was a very close advisor to Prime Minister Mazowiecki at the time. We spoke, I think, in ways that went several steps beyond, so to speak, the discussion that came out in Polonsky. Interestingly enough, it was not picked up by anyone. Even though it's the same milieu, actually, these articles were sent around. Bartoszewski was one of the people who were supposed to respond to it. Jacek Puroń as well. And somehow it sort of petered out. I had a correspondence exchange at the time between Smolar and Bartoszewski, and it involved a statement that Jan Józef Lipski had made, which was also a very important statement. Jan Józef Lipski, an incredibly significant figure in Polish opposition, and also in a kind of an opening towards confronting this xenophobic tradition that informed Polish politics. For those of you who don't read Polish, Lipski is the author of a truly wonderful book about the Workers' Defense Committee, of which he was a founding member, that played such an important role in the 70s and 80s. And the foundation of Solidarity movement. So what stands to me as a very interesting question is, when is it that issues that turn out to be a very dramatic and kind of a full of potentially, that are very catchy, judging by how deeply the public gets at some point invested in them, when these issues somehow make it to the surface and become subjects of general discussion. In that sense, of course, neighbors becomes a kind of a very significant moment. It really breaks through, and the accumulated sort of positions, issues, arguments, a variety of things that has been brewing in people's minds somehow spill out, and people feel very moved to articulate them and to address them. Why was it, in fact, that finally this was a book that accomplished it, even though several texts had been written before, the kind of an awareness of it was in the air? And I have a very good answer, and I mean, it would be tempting to say that it was such a wonderful piece of writing, etc., etc. It's a lot of very good pieces of writings have been put out. Somebody pointed out to me an aspect of it, which I think maybe to a large extent an answer to this. And this friend of mine said, you know, this is this CC phenomenon. When you send an email to someone to do something, and then you write a CC to somebody who is in the eyes of the person to whom you addressed it of some significance and importance, you immediately get answer. And just a lot of things happen that otherwise would not. In this case, she said, it was the fact of publication of this book in English. And in fact, when I think about it, the discussion in Poland, I happened to be in Poland during the year after it came out and was part of the very intense debate. It had a kind of a natural dynamic to it. And this natural dynamic was predicated on two moments. One of them was the date of publication of this book in English, and it was spring of 2001. The book came out in late May of 2000. And then the other item, also a kind of a public event, it was the preparation for this public ceremony that was supposed to, took place, and we mentioned it, in July, on the anniversary of the exact anniversary, July 10th of 2001 in Litvak. What will happen then, what kind of a statement, and a kind of an international response to it there will be. So much as I would like to sort of take credit for mobilizing the kind of a good and bad at the same time instincts of my compatriots, it seems to me that what really made the difference here was that this was a project where, in fact, there was this CC item on the book somehow, and it really, I mean, several things happened at the time. You know, for example, just before the book came out in English, Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs made a concerted effort to put out English translation of several articles that have come out already by then, by the spring of 2001, in the Polish debate. And Polish consulates have received these, the book, and they could distribute it freely. I may say also, parenthetically, that the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has just published a book in English of translations of several articles that appeared in Polish periodicals and press in response to fear, most of them critical, some of them not so critical, and it's sort of available. It created a kind of a, this is coming back to this issue that Antony wanted to put out, namely the phenomenon of reception. It already had a kind of an echo in the right-wing Catholic press, where one of the most vociferous opponents of really airing this issue of Polish-Jewish relations, a fellow who just writes, is a very prolific writer, and after the publication of Neighbors wrote a book which was called 100 Lies of the Cross. Now he published another book which was in fact a kind of a compilation of 21 articles, very long each of them, in the daily Nasz Dziennik, which is called Further Lies of the Cross. And it was a big piece in which he truly went after this publication of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But the issue there was, why didn't they translate my writings that were really critical of Gross? So, you know, there's a kind of a, the public is ready, so to speak, and waiting, I think. I'm in the process of producing this Polish translation. It's not an easy task, I must say. It's just, it's a very exhausting subject. And it's very important to write it properly, too. You know, this is an issue with which I became, I'm very much aware of it, this first essay which I published in Annex in the early issue of 1980s. I delivered it first as a talk in English, and somebody translated it. And actually, this was a horrific translation. Unfortunately, it was not published in that format. It was sent around to people for discussion. So I later had to rewrite it. Now I'm writing it again, and it's a very painful process. But it will be out. It will be out in the summer. The Catholic publishing house, Znak in Krakow, is putting it out. It's a very good publishing house, and they are about to published an even more scandalous book by a priest who had assembled historical materials from the archives of the secret police on collaboration of priests in the Krakow area, and you can imagine that this whole story will generate quite a discussion. I mean, there are too many important questions here to raise. I will only say that the discussion following Neighbors was extraordinarily profound and deep. Well, I can actually get into this question of how many people were killed, and the investigation of the issue of national memory. I mean, this is a very lucky circumstance for me, and I think for Poland, that the man who was in charge of the Institute of National Memory at the time was a man of just impeccable integrity as a public servant, and that these two huge volumes that were published, some of it were studies, and the other documents, were really produced with tremendous attention to fairness and detail. What's going on now, this Institute of National Memory, as Antony mentioned, this is a slew of Endek historians took it over, and it led even to a scandalous piece of this new fellow who is in charge of the Bureau of National Education, who publishes ex officio introduction to a volume that has been prepared before, and in fact this undermines the text of this volume on the Polish-Jewish relations during the war. One of the reviewers called it literally scandalous. So if they were in charge at the time, the Institute of National Memory would have produced a very bizarre, I think, findings indeed. How many people have been killed? This is the investigation that has been carried out by a sort of investigatory branch. Again, a very decent man who conducted it. To a large extent, it was left up in the air. They said it's very unlikely that 1,600 people had been killed there. But if you look at the depositions that were made during the trial in 1949, there are several statements from people, and most of them come from Poles, from Polish witnesses, or those who were in some ways implicated. And all of them sort of point out, they say 1,500 something, 1,600 something, 1,200. So it's just a matter of how many Jews there were in the apartment at the time. One cannot say very specifically how many exactly. But all the evidence we have from the period is that this is more or less the ballpark figure. Even though some demographic studies had been, and there's a big demographic essay in, but it's totally unconvincing. I don't want to go into it. And of course, as he says, it doesn't matter. 800 people or 1,600 killed there. It's the same story. But to be frank, there's no good grounds to say that there hadn't been that many killed. One thing is has not been contested by anybody, that this was essentially an effort and to a large extent successful of killing everybody who was there. So again, if only 800 had been killed, part of the discussion had to do with the size of the barn and how many people can be put in. if not that many people have been burned in the barn, then a lot of people have been killed in just individual episodes in which local peasants chased the local Jews and simply killed them with kind of handheld implements, so to speak. So this is, it was very lucky. It seems to me that the book could have had such a scrutiny, and indeed it was just unbelievably detailed and stand up to it. The next one will be much more complicated, of course. It's an interpretive piece, and I expect to get a lot of flack, so to speak. And but you know, that's the way it goes, so to speak. Let me finally say one word also about the kind of Antony mentioned that in this early discussion that took place of this issue in the 1980s, it was not historians who took part. It was mostly ethicists, literary scholars, sociologists, anthropologists. I must say that as far as discussion of neighbors is concerned, the most interesting voices also came from outside of the profession. I don't know what to attribute it to. There were some very good and there are some wonderful historians who do great work now in the field and who lay out lots of new facts, especially that center that he mentioned on the study of the Holocaust with the new yearly publication, Zagłada Żydów, the destruction, the Holocaust of the Jews. There are some stunning pieces. In the first issue there was fantastic work. And I would say there is a half a dozen of young historians who have absolutely no qualms addressing any subject in a totally open-minded way in this domain. So in that sense, there is a lot to be expected. But big historians who are public intellectuals in Poland, and history is a very important field in that way, who speak quite often on television, have not spoken very prolifically or very intelligently on this, I must say, and in a way which I find to be very regrettable. The kind of the public forum has been given to this new crop of sort of nationalistically tinted scholars, while in a previous generation of historians, there is just several brilliant intellectuals of a completely different kind of a political persuasion. They did not step up to the plate, and with few exceptions and kind of occasional statements, but it was very difficult. So I'm hoping that it's literary historians, anthropologists, and young historians, and literary critics like Głowinski and others, or Maria Jana, for example, who will pick up the story and carry it further.
Actually, I think at this point, since there's a lot of implicit dialogue already in the two presentations, it would be nice to open up from the floor, unless you'd like to...
I just make one point. It's a technical point.
But be aware of the audibility. Can you hear at the back?
No, I'll stand to this. Jana asked at the end why Polish historians haven't involved themselves in this debate. I think that there's a Polish historiography which essentially was developed in Galicia, was heavily positivistic in the German sense. And this positivistic, that is fact-based historiography, was intensified in the Soviet period, or in the communist period, because history continued in this period. But the way in which people continued to write history was by writing heavily fact-based studies with introductions which made the compulsory obeisances to Marxism, Leninism, and without conclusions, because if you had a conclusion, you spelled out what you were saying. And this had a very bad effect on the way in which historical scholarship developed. I just make that point.
Well, I will be the traffic.
Yes, please.
I don't want to be a cop of any kind. What shall I be? Traffic controller. That's better. Okay, and so Gus, which gentleman in the blue, Depot? Okay, so Gus, please. Gus Reed.
I've got 2 questions. One, you mentioned the episode that is doing the...
Gus, could you maybe stand up so I'm sensitive to people being able to hear?
I have 2 questions. One is that you talked about the 2 episodes, one during the German occupation, one after the war. I'm interested in what happened before World War II. I know I lived in Germany, as a German Jew in Germany, and I remember a lot of Polish Jews streamed from Poland to Germany to escape the war. So this anti-Semitism in Poland has a long history, just like anti-Semitism in Germany has a long history. I'd like to hear a little more about the causes of Polish anti-Semitism. I know a little bit about the causes of German anti-Semitism. I'd like to hear about Polish anti-Semitism. The second question has to do with the role of the church. I went to Poland in the 90s, looking for history of some relatives of mine who had last been seen in Poland. We went looking for places, and whenever we saw in the church, we got a very short trip, very nasty response. Obviously, anti-Semitic, maybe we had a bad sample, but I had the impression that the church was very anti-Semitic before, from my little sample. I wonder what the role of the church has been through all these 3 episodes.
So the questions for the back of the room, the first one is a question about, from the point of view of someone who grew up in Germany, what were the pre-war origins of Polish anti-Semitism? And the second question, has been the role of the Catholic Church in Poland in relation to anti-Semitism?
Jan will talk about the Catholic Church. I'll say a few words about anti-Semitism. The problem with the way in which Polish-Jewish relations developed in the interwar period was that as a result of the failure to transform the Jews in the 19th century within the Polish-speaking areas into citizens or subjects of the Polish nation, in other words, Poles of the Jewish faith, by the end of the 19th century, Jews themselves in these areas defined themselves nationally as Jews and were seen by the surrounding population as a separate national group. There were some exceptions, people who were Polonized. Jan's family is one example, but the percentage of Polonized Jews who thought of themselves as Poles was perhaps 10% higher in Galicia than elsewhere in Poland. What this meant was that in the interwar period, what Jews were looking for in Poland was both individual rights, the rights guaranteed as citizens, but also group rights, the rights to have their own educational system, the right to use their own language in the courts and elsewhere. And as we know, it's much more difficult to guarantee group rights than individual rights. If you periodize the interwar period, between 1918 and 21, when there was the struggle to establish the borders of Poland, there were conflicts because Jews wanted either to be neutral in these conflicts, for instance in the town of Lvov, they wanted to be neutral in the Polish-Ukrainian conflict, or in the town of Vilna or Vilnius, they took the Lithuanian side. They were also identified by some Poles as linked with the Bolsheviks. Between 21 and 26 you had a parliamentary system. It started with a rather difficult situation for the Jews, but from about 24, 25, in particular, the Prime Minister, Brandeis, reached an agreement in Polish, the Ugoda, with the Jewish club, by which the Jews recognized the borders of Poland, the 1921 borders, and in return, a set of concessions were made. There's some argument about how this agreement was implemented, but I take a more positive view than some of the other writers on this. And this policy was continued under Pilsudski. Pilsudski came to power in a coup in May 1926. He could be defined as an anti-Semite. His political opponents, the Indetsia, were the anti-Semites. He was attacked, he was married twice. His second wife was not a Jew, or a Jewish woman. But they had to be married in the Protestant church because there was no divorce. So she was always referred to as Żydówka and his daughters as Żydówki, which he resented very much. But he also took the view that Poland was a Poland of all the neighboring groups which were in it, including the Ukrainians. We have Tim Snyder in the audience who wrote about Józefski, who's part of this attempt to reach out to the Ukrainians. This situation changed around 1935. After 1935, after the death of Pilsudski, the situation of Jews in Poland deteriorated seriously, and there were 3 reasons for this. One was the successful conquest of power by the Nazis in Germany, and the fact that they were able, without much opposition from the outside world, to take action against one of the best integrated and most prosperous Jewish communities in Europe. This was a terrible example to everybody else. And moreover, the Nazis also financed anti-Semitic activity in Poland, both among Volksdeutsche, but also among some Polish groups. Secondly, there was a struggle for power among the successors of Pilsudski. Some wanted to return to a parliamentary system. The President Waszczycki was one of these. Others wished to win over the support of the younger nationalists by creating something in Poland similar to the fascist or semi-fascist regimes which were emerging all over Europe. And part of this was the adoption of an anti-Semitic policy. When this political movement was established by Colonel Kotz, the so-called Camp of National Unity in Polish Ozon, it said that no Jews could be members, and anti-Semitic agitation was now increasingly used by the government. One of the figures linked with the government was Boleslav Piasecki, who played a rather negative role as a Catholic collaborator with the communists after 1944. Thirdly, the Great Depression in Poland lasted at least until 1936, because the Polish government pursued a policy of keeping the zloty stable. It had been one of its main achievements. This, of course, keeping a high currency is a way of preserving unemployment. And so there was very high unemployment. The depression was extremely severe in Poland, 25% fall in the GNP between 29 and 33. And the easy solution to this problem was to say, well, the unemployment is caused by all these Jews, so Jews should leave. So from after 35, anti-Semitic agitation spread very widely. And it spread particularly widely in the Lithuanian areas like this. This was a strongly nationalist area, and there is a very good piece in the Lithuanian volume on the rise of anti-Semitism after 1935. The question of people fleeing to Germany, that's a little earlier. In fact, what happened, in 1938, the Kristallnacht was provoked, as you know, by the fact that there were 30,000 Jews in Germany with Polish passports. And the German government kept saying we're going to expel them. And the Polish government was nervous about this, so it took away from these Jews their Polish passports and the right to return to Poland. The Germans then expelled them, and that's what precipitated Herschel Grünschmann's attack on von Rath. But this, of course, was not a friendly act on either side.
Very quickly on the role of the church in these two episodes. In the case of Litvak, we've been deceased by now a friend of mine, who a priest, a remarkable person from Krakow, Stanisław Musiał, said at one point in discussions over these issues that the place for the priest of Litvak was in the barn with the Jews. That's where he should have been if he were true to his vocation, if you will. And this was not the case. The priests in this area in particular, starting with the local bishop, were very vociferously anti-Semitic. They were voting for, and very actively so, for Endecja, for the National Democrats, and were active in all kinds of anti-Jewish episodes that took place before the war, and during the war were just utterly not helpful. There is in the volume that's published by the Institute of National Memory an incredibly interesting memoir of a woman from a neighboring town, of a Jewish woman, from a neighboring town of Radziłów, who actually a very similar act of mass murder takes place 3 days before Litvak. She is there, survives with her family in the end, and makes that deposition in 1946 in Yad Vashem. And she describes it, among other things, the process of negotiations that went on between the Jewish community there. This was a fairly wealthy family, and she was involved in these negotiations, with various important figures in town on the Polish side, because the kind of atmosphere was increasingly frightening, and the assaults on Jews were kind of coming up, if you wish, in intensity before that final assault where they were all killed took place. And including conversations with the priest, and the priest is just utterly unwilling to do anything. He just says, we know that all of you are communists, and I'm not going to intervene on your behalf. Just he was ready to help one or two families, and including her family in the end, but would not act on behalf and kind of intercede with the Polish population. The church's position vis-a-vis the program after the war in 1946 is very bad as well. I mean, I described it in the book. It's essentially clergy is anti-Semitic. One of the elements of that program is the rumor that at the time, immediately after the war, Poland had really wide circulation of ritual murder that takes place, of Christian children being killed, so the Jews can harvest blood. And several of Polish bishops, actually two, are on record at that time saying that one of them, in fact straightforwardly, that such a thing took place in Kielce, the other saying, well, this issue is unclear yet. And the British ambassador at the time, who had some of these conversations, the Brits were very worried, of course, because under the impact of this program, there was this huge flight of Jews who were eventually trying to, so they were worried to have a kind of a population pressure in Palestine, which was still a mandatory responsibility for Britain. He had a lot of conversations with very high officials of the church and writes the cables to the Foreign Office, which deplores the anti-Semitism of them. But there is one exception, this wonderful statement that's been made by the Bishop of Częstochowa at the time, and then 2 months later, this is an episode that takes place in July, and in September there is a meeting of Polish bishops of the episcopate, and there is a collective letter of the episcopate in which they essentially protest and censor the man who had made this statement in July. So they are on record, the Polish Church representatives, if you will, the hierarchy of the Polish Church, as that record is terrible.
So on my list is next Richard Freyberg, then Giovanna, then Jonathan in the blue sweater, and then I'll put you on your list. Yes.
Sure.
Yes. Okay. Richard, please.
I have a question and a remark. Question goes to Jan. I learned from your book that before this book came out, actually there was a film made by Agnieszka Arnold on the same incident that Litvak describes so wonderfully in this book. So I wonder why this film, obviously being broadcasted on Polish television and documentary, did not make the same splash as your book. Because normally we attribute film to more public resonance than your book. So what actually made the difference? And the remark is on language. I learned from Professor Polonsky today that there are these long-standing definitions, ethnic divisions of Jews, not thinking of themselves as primarily Poles, but Jews within the Polish community. But I was always struck, and I was even struck by Jan's work, using the same concepts, the same kind of linguistic concepts to describe who you were talking about, Poles against Jews. And I wonder if we as scholars should not make an attempt to move beyond the contemporary universe of people, contemporary mindset of people who think of themselves as either Poles or Jews, but as scholars today try to have a more distance view and talk about Catholic Poles and Jewish Poles instead of talking about Poles and Jews.
Very quickly about Agnieszka Arnold's film. There are two films that she had made. One of them was put out before the story of Jedwabne, the book Neighbors was published. And this was a film that was a very general film on the question of Polish-Jewish relations, with essentially interviews with a lot of people who are usually interviewed in this context. And at some point in that film, there is a mention that the killing of the Jews by Poles took place in Jedwabne. This is not really a film on Litvak. This is, and it's just a sentence. So unless somebody, and then, but her documentary, and she was, I don't want to say by this that she was not aware of this matter. She was aware of this matter, and actually she had the presence of mind before I did to go to Litvak and to investigate this matter seriously. We both read independently the position of the man who survived, and it's just a striking deposition, but she was clever enough to take it seriously, go there, and actually very quickly discover, because people there would speak openly about it, that this is indeed something that has taken place. And then she started working on a film. But her documentary film came out about a year after the book. It literally came in April of 2001. It's an important date because it's before, for example, the public event that took place in July and so forth. But on television, it was shown in April. It was, I think, 2 consecutive nights, 1-hour program each time, very powerful, and it made quite a big difference. Then there was, I remember, on television immediately afterwards, kind of a discussion in which the head of the Institute of National Memory took place as well. A very important one. So, yes, it was there.
Well, Anthony, I think, let me make an administrative intervention here. If we could, there are lots of people who want to ask questions, so.
I just want to talk about Poles and Jews, which you raised.
Oh, okay. But if we could just be brief to have as many as possible. Okay.
Jan said that one of the heroes of this episode was Leon Keres, and Leon Keres was awarded the St. George Prize. St. George apparently no longer exists, but he's still seen as a symbol of a person who fights evil. And when Father Broniecki, the editor of Pragmatic, awarded him the prize, he said that as director of the Institute of National Memory,
can't be heard.
As director of the Institute of National Memory, we're often attacked because all you've done is investigate crimes which have been committed against Poles, not crimes which have been committed by Poles, not crimes which have been committed against Poles. And your great virtue is that you saw, which none of us really perceived, that the Jews at Litvak were Poles. Poles of a different faith and of a different ethnicity, but Polish citizens and Poles nonetheless. That's absolutely right, but the problem is that there are a lot of words that historians use which are defective. Pogrom and anti-Semitism are just 2. And Jews and Poles are also highly problematic. But to keep using paraphrases makes the stuff unreadable, and you really can't avoid using these terms. But one needs to make the qualification at the outset, I think, which you've already made.
Gentleman in the blue sweater, whose name I do not know.
The presentations are fascinating. I know that the 2 of you don't do this, but in the lay public, simplistically, too often the history of Jews in Poland is portrayed in terms of the deaths of the Holocaust with footnotes in places like Litvak and Kilchvik. The question that I have is, particularly since the publication of your book, since the discussion of Litvak, as you know, the life of the Jews in Poland before the war was incredibly rich, and I don't mean financially, but in terms of culture and religion and vitality. Has your book and the discussions that have followed, has that contributed to any discussion of a sense of a loss within Poland of that richness? That's part A of my question. And part B, I know that there is work afoot to create a museum in Warsaw for the history of Jewish life. Do you see that as playing any role or anything meaningful in this discussion?
There has been, I don't know that this discussion and application of neighbors had any impact on it, but I must say that there has been, for as long as I remember, and certainly since 1989 when I started going to Poland again, there is a visible and very intense, if you wish, interest on the part, I mean, obviously, of just general Polish public in the Jewish life in Poland. If you go to a bookstore, you'll find a number of Judaica, albums, etc. You probably have been there, so you know it. And then there is the other phenomenon, to my mind, an event that takes place every year in Krakow. It's unique. as far as I can tell, and this is the International Festival of Jewish Culture, about a 2-week, a 10-day event. Every musician from New York who has anything to do with klezmer, I mean klezmer in this new folk klezmer, if you wish, goes there and finds it just absolutely stimulating and invigorating. And it's an event in which the whole town in some way participates. That's nationally televised at the end, you know. It's, in the last few years, the weather was good, but it used to be, several years ago, that in the last concert where everybody plays, all the bands and all the musicians, it's held in an open space in what was the Jewish section of the town, Kazimierz, kind of it's called street, but in fact it's a huge square, and it's packed with people. There used to be rain, year after year. It didn't make any difference. People just stayed there with umbrellas, danced, and it were not just phony imported Jews, so to speak. I mean, there were some of them real Jews, some of them phony Jews, and a lot of local people. It's just, it has a place now in life of this city, which is a very important city in Polish life. And I think that this museum is part of course, of the same spirit of renewed interest.
Galin, please. Galin Panov.
There is a question to the speakers. Professor Polonsky said in his expose that there is now a new climate of genius rising in Poland. And he spoke a little bit about the European Union as a factor. And this is probably not confined to Poland. Along the British press has been covering over the last 12 months or so rising anti-Semitic sentiments in France and elsewhere. My question is, to what extent do you think this was conditioned or influenced by the debates within the European Union whether the EU constitution should or should not contain an explicit reference to Europe's religious inheritance and identity, and how Polish intellectuals and politicians reacted to that?
Well, as you know, Chancellor Merkel's raising this thing again. I think that this is not a key issue here. If you talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, there are 3 factors at issue. One is that it's 50 years and more since the Holocaust, and there's some taboos have been broken. Secondly, there's a widespread criticism of Israeli behavior in a sense that the problems of the Middle East could be solved if Israel could be coerced into making all sorts of concessions. And the third is anti-Americanism. In the context of Poland, compared to England, so, which I know quite well since I spent a lot of time there, there's less of that. Poland is probably, along with England, the least anti-American or the most pro-American country in Europe. And also, because of a series of reasons, anti-Semitism is a problem in Poland, but anti-Zionism is not. Because of the fact that the Jews are seen historically as a national group in Poland, the Poles have no problem with the idea of a Jewish state. When Pope John Paul II went to Yad Vashem, he talked about the sufferings of the Jewish nation, Narodu Żydowski. You can't imagine the Western statesmen talking about a Jewish nation. And it doesn't sound, it sounds odd in English. So I think that's a different issue. On the question of the Polish attitudes to the EU, the European barometer, there's more people in Poland are still in favor of being in the EU than not. The European Constitution is something which would have been problematic for Poland, so the fact that the preamble wasn't in is actually not that important. The Poles are the strongest advocates of Turkish entry into the EU, and that's, I think, a significant factor. What I would say is that there is now, generally in Eastern Europe, a new generation which didn't live under communism. Now, those of us who lived through the communist experience, although we were strongly opposed to it, Jan and I share this background. I didn't live in Poland, but I was actively involved in the solidarity. Know that the other side, the side that we were against, had many good people in it, and that it was not all black and white. But there is now a sense that among younger people that all sorts of unnecessary compromises were made, and all those people who made them should be condemned. This is not only a Polish phenomenon. The 50th anniversary of the Hungarian Abramson was very different from the 40th anniversary. And if you look at the Tibor Fischer article in the TLS about how people, which is a good indication of attitudes, how the opposition parties in Hungary see somebody like János Kadar, that Kadar is sort of worse than Rákosi now. This is part of what is going on, and this makes some of the self-critical attitudes which are necessary for the sort of debates which are provoked by the work that Jan has been doing more difficult to achieve. There is also the sense, was articulated by the previous Minister of Education before Gertig, that we need something in our past about which we can be proud. I mean, this is the same issue which came up in the Historikerstreit. I think these debates are up to a point cyclical. And there is a sense in Poland that we need to have something in our past which we can feel good about. And if everything is bad, if the Polish myth of Poland, the martyr and hero of the nations, is all false, what is left? I think those are the issues here.
Charles?
Okay, so just to sort of follow up on this question, Professor Gross, you mentioned that some of the public intellectuals are becoming more nationalistic than before. So I was wondering, in Polish society, as in Eastern European countries, with the collapse of communism and the joining of the EU, it would seem to me that there's tremendous socioeconomic and political changes in Polish society. And with the influx, now that Poland joined the EU and the influx of foreign capital and the gentrification of urban areas, how does the old anti-Semitism, which seems structured into Polish society, how is the Jew being portrayed given all this sort of turmoil in Polish society?
I mean, in the old days, there actually was a Jew portrayed, but today there isn't a Jew. So it's a literary fiction, so to speak, and actually it's a discussion and it's a debate about the past. And if I mentioned that public intellectuals, historians, as public intellectuals, now taking part openly in debates, writing in the daily newspapers and so forth, have shifted, it's not that people change their minds, but it's that those who had previously been vociferous, very visible, active and listened to, don't write that much anymore. What had taken place also is that a kind of a center of gravity of recognized and visible newspapers and public fora has shifted. So that, for instance, really a highly objectionable daily newspaper, which is called Our Daily, and that's xenophobic and just silly and very kind of a populistic Catholic. Strangely, it became a kind of a government, the preferred forum for government officials to give interviews. You know, it's with the change of crew at the Institute of National Memory, and suddenly this complete obsession with the files of the secret police and historians, one after another, from the current the politicized crew of the Institute of National Memory, kind of appearing on television and saying, well, yes, this document, I think it's authentic, and this is not authentic. Suddenly they just give you a kind of a certificate of propriety, so to speak, just out of a hat, so to speak. And this is what happened, you know. And to what extent it has to do with the coming to Europe, I don't know, but maybe Antony's intuition is right. There was a period. First of all, it was the old generation, the generation of those who have really, who were architects of that change. They had a task and understood that it's an unfinished business of bringing Poland within the institutions, plenty of first and then European community. And they were very mobilized, and they did. And then they kind of pulled back, and this new crew moved in with a vengeance. And it's a bizarre spectacle.
Once again, I'm going to intervene now administratively, because I realize everyone in this room is freezing. That's number one. And everyone wants to go home and have dinner. So I propose, before any long disquisitions, there are 2 more people on my list of questions. Let these 2 people ask their questions briefly, and then if there are any thoughts in response, and then we'll all go home and sit around the stove. Because this is Yale, and for some reason they can't eat this room. Or maybe it's because they know we're talking about Eastern Europe. So we should be mimetically cold. So I think this gentleman in the first row has a question, and then the gentleman in the gray sweater, and then a brief response.
Take both questions.
Yes, both questions, one after the other, and then we'll go jump around and recirculate our
My name is Charles Chatkowski. I'm from Fairfield. I had more of a comment than a question. I complied with your instructions and read Professor Polonsky's paper before I came. And I'm here to say that I agree with just about everything in it, excepting for one thing, where he states that relatively few Jews now consider the Poles as bad as the Germans. I do have to disagree. I think the proportion of those who are hostile to the Poles is greater than you say. I have also read both Fear and Neighbors by Professor Gross, and then there are many things I disagree with, which of course I do not have time to list. I will merely observe that one could make a good defense for the behavior of the Catholic Church at the time of the Kielce pogrom. I think it is unfortunate that in this country, where we have a lot of Polish Americans, you don't hear from us very much. Just about every review of Fear that appeared in a major newspaper was very hostile to the Poles. Most of them were written by Jewish professors, as a matter of fact. The one for the New York Times resurrected Yitzhak Shamir's old canard about Poles sucking in anti-Semitism with their mother's milk, for which I wrote a letter to the Times. I also sent them a correction. They deep-sixed my letter and published the correction as my letter. So that was their way of handling it. Quick question. Professor Gross has talked about a takeover of the IPN, the Institute of National Remembrance. What is his opinion of their volume on the Kielce pogrom? Thank you.
Gentleman in the gray sweater.
Yes, I was wondering if you know why the room isn't heated. My question is more about why do you think, briefly, some of the reasons why anti-Semitism has persisted today in Poland, to whatever degree it exists after the Holocaust and briefly, I was actually in Krakow this summer, went to the music festival, Klezmer Music, which was great. Also went on a tour of Auschwitz, which was run by a city agency, and I was struck during that tour how the guide insisted that the Poles had been equal victims of the Nazis and really had not participated in all the activities leading up to the Holocaust. And I was wondering if you know if any kind of education, and if there have been any changes in Polish education.
Well, I will make one comment on the last comment before we go on. I was in Auschwitz this summer too, and I had a Polish guide who was wonderful. She was about 40 years old. She had beautiful English. She understood that there were many different victims of different kinds and not necessarily equivalent, but each one having its own story and its own problem attached to it. So I think if you're going to go anecdotal, there's a certain danger in that, and you can find examples some examples which that go in different directions. So I'm just throwing out an anecdote.
On that question, there is, of course, an international committee for the State Museum at the Auschwitz concentration camp, which has tried very hard to deal with the question of training guides adequately and having proper signage. I was on that commission when I was still in England. I know a lot of people are still on it. I think they're doing a very good job. I think the people in the museum in particular, Mrs. Shimotska, the director of the museum, have done a very good job. The museum published this very good little pamphlet on the actual victims. I think that we now have figures which are also more or less accepted by Yad Vashem. About 1.1 million people probably, this is a low figure, this is the determined, died in Auschwitz, about 960,000 of them were Jews, 75,000, I mean, using these terms which we can't get rid of, 75,000 were Poles, another 15,000 were Sinti and Rom, 20,000 were, I mean, it was Soviet prisoners, another 15,000 were Western Europeans. This is well known, and you can buy this material in English in the bookshop at the museum in Auschwitz. Things are much better there than they were.
Antony did mention one item on the sort of Auschwitz scene. One of his students is now in charge of one of the kind of the research centers that is permanently stationed there. So things are better and better. And as far as the volume that is published by ISGAP on Kielce, it's a good volume. The documents there are good, but the introductory essay by the current head of the Institute's Bureau of Education is scandalous. So
I'd like to make one point about the reception of fear, which is relevant to Poland, and it's also sort of key to Jan. It is a pity that the wrong people were asked to review it. I think that the scholarly reviews in the American, in the Slavic Review, American Scholarly will be much better. We're also going to have a symposium which Jan will contribute also in volume 22 of Forum. But I think that what is very important about, we haven't had a chance to discuss fear, but what is very important about fear, which is really a set of essays rather than a single book, is the first chapter, which does document very fully the sufferings of Poles in the sense which we've been using this term during the Second World War. Shows how the Poles were betrayed by the Western Allies, shows how the Poles suffered at Soviet hands. That's very important for an American and a Western audience to read, and it's all there, something that wasn't in Neighbours. And I think that it is important for that to be in Polish. I know you're going to say everybody knows this in Poland, but I don't know that you say it. And from a public relations point of view, it is extremely important to have that in the Polish edition of Neighbours. I know that you don't agree. You don't want to chuck it, you want to play it back.
I'm going to be the traffic controller again, because not everyone in this audience is aware of all these details and so on. And I'll just make one comment also about, I hope we have more time talking about fear. Fear is a gruesome description of what happened in Kielce, but there's a very interesting argument here. And since it's past the time at the end, we won't have to be able to discuss it. But part of the argument in this book is, and maybe it's well made or not well made, that the Poles felt guilty, that there is a public conscience about what happened in the war. So it is really dangerous to oversimplify books, especially when we haven't read them, especially when it's after the end of the symposium. But I want to thank, and before we leave, there's an announcement about the next event in this series, but I just, before letting you say that, I want to thank both of you for coming, raising difficult issues.
And just thank you. Just very briefly, next week at the same time at 4:15 in room 101 of the same building, there's an important seminar by Yigal Karman, who's going to be speaking about Ahmadinejad and the Iranian situation. So from one Holocaust to a Holocaust denier, I think it's a very important lecture next week. And also on behalf of our program, I'd like to thank you, Professor Eaglestein, and the speakers for a wonderful event.
Thank you all. It all began when I thought, as director of the European Council on European Studies, which embraces all of Europe, Western Europe, all the way across to what used to be called Russia and Eastern Europe. It's still Eastern Europe, probably. It's ex-Soviet Union, but not ex-Eastern Europe. And so immediately came to my attention that Jan Gross's new book had just appeared this summer, and that he was a very important both scholar and voice in public debate these days, and it really was a good idea to invite him to come to Yale. So we went back and forth by email, and we troubled and brought our heads together. We found a date, we found a time. Everything was set up, we arranged, we agreed, we have a wonderful administrator, everything was in the system, it was all sort of semi-online, emails were flying, and we know that we can't tell people about something too far in advance, so just as it's approaching the time, we start to advertise. Lo and behold, we get an email from another part of Yale University, the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. He will say this more precisely, saying, on this very same day, at this very same time, we have invited Professor Antony Polonsky to speak on the subject of Jan Gross. This demonstrates, on the one hand, the essential chaos of Yale, and on the other hand, the essential reality of intelligent design. Someone up there organized two events at the same time on the same subject. And we, being more intelligent than the intelligent designer, decided, well, we will bring them together and have them talk to each other. And not surprisingly, given it was the same subject, they actually know each other and have talked with each other before in public, probably also in private. So that is the reason that there are two sponsors for this event, and the sponsor, the other half of the sponsors will introduce his half of the event, so to speak, so that we will all learn about this other part of Yale, which actually I know very little about myself. The format will be that the subject of today's discussion is provoked by the works of Jan Gross, Professor Gross, and I'll introduce him in a minute. And the format will be that the discussant, Professor Polonsky, will initiate the event by speaking for 15 or 20 minutes. And then Professor Gross will then speak for another 15 minutes, and then they will be able to exchange ideas or reply to each other, or have some kind of exchange, dialogue, for however much it makes sense to have it. And then we will also open the floor to discussion and questions and remarks from the floor, keeping in mind that it's a dialogue, it's a discussion. So we want questions posed and back and forth. And at the center of attention for this afternoon's event is, in fact, I'm sure Professor Gross would be really upset if I said the center of attention left him, but I will say that the center of attention is his work.
Gross. So it's really an honor to introduce Professor Polonsky.
Well, the center of today's discussion is obviously Jan Gross, and I feel a little embarrassed speaking first, but when I heard that we were both speaking on the same day, I felt that there was no way we could handle things like this except by doing it together. What we're looking at today is the question of Polish-Jewish relations and Polish-Jewish attempts at Polish-Jewish understanding. This phrase Polish-Jewish in a way highlights what the problem is, because after all Jews were citizens of Poland. And the problem was that in some sense the Jews were not considered as Poles. The two groups were separate. So what we should really be talking about is Poles of Jewish origin and Poles of Christian and agnostic origin. And maybe some groups fall in between, and of course there are also groups which can be seen as neither of these groups. Jan is an example of this. Jan has a very distinguished background. His grandfather was representative in the Austrian Reichsrat of the so-called Club of Progressive Jews, elected mostly by non-Jews in Krakow. His maternal grandfather was a very well-known criminal lawyer who defended Jews, but who was not himself Jewish. So he is a person who illustrates or combines these problems. So what I'd like to do in the very short period at my disposal, because I really would like to put down the floor as well, is to look firstly at the way in which debates between Poles and Jews, terms which I'm not wholly comfortable, have developed. Then to look at the way in which these debates were transformed, firstly by the emergence of Jan's book Neighbors, and now by his new book Fear, which of course hasn't yet come out in Polish, so the debates are really at an early stage. And then finally to say something about the question of reception. That is to say, historians write essentially by the historians, but there is also a wider audience for which we all hope to reach. And I want to ask, how far has this debate reached a wider audience, particularly above all in Poland itself, but also outside Poland? Now, the central question in Polish Jewish, what divides Poles and Jews today is essentially the past, or different views of the past. There are some other issues, for instance, the issue of property restitution, private property restitution, but this is a less important issue, and although I'm not a particular sympathizer with the present Polish government, it does seem to be making some sort of an effort to deal with this issue, and this is, in my view, increasingly a marginal issue. So what really divides Poles and Jews is different views over the past, and particularly different views over the Second World War. The basic
After the war, the Germans are defeated. Jews are either returned to Poland or returned to their places of origin, and there is a, as we say in Russian history, a pogrom, in which this is the famous Kelta pogrom, an event which is not unknown, but here light is shown upon it in great detail and in dimension, and there's an argument that emerges from this book. It has not yet been published in Polish. I don't know whether it has yet entered into Polish, also civic discourse. So Jan Gross is both, what we would all like to be sort of part of our fantasy lives as historians, scholars, and serious engagement with the sources and problems of history, and also, to some extent, have an effect on how people think about the past and the present. And the theme that is engaged, of course, in all of this recent work is the relationship between Jews and Poles under the pressure of the war and the post-war period. And that is the format for today's discussion. And that is why these two discussants can sit together at the same table under the aegis of the Council on European Studies and the Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and talk about, I think on the occasion of this book, which is subtitled Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz. So it is my enormous pleasure to welcome Jan Gross and his interlocutor, Antony Polonsky, and turn the podium over to my colleague, Charles Small.
So thank you. So just a brief few words about the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism for those who don't know about it. We were just launched in September. We run a seminar series, and we're going to be housing research projects of the sort. So for people who don't know about us, if you want to receive our emails, we send out emails regularly in a newsletter about issues of anti-Semitism, mostly contemporary anti-Semitism. I'd be happy to take your names down. So this is a new program. It's actually the first at a North American university that's focused on the interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism. So it's a great honor to be a part of this event, and I'll be very quick and brief. I would like to introduce to you Professor Polonsky. He is the Albert Abramson Professor of Holocaust Studies at Brandeis University. He also has an appointment at the Holocaust Museum of the United States. Professor Polonsky is an expert on the subject of Polish history and Polish Jewish history in particular. I won't go into the amount of books and articles that he's written, prolific writer. He recently just received a very prestigious award in Poland called the Felix Scharf Statuette, which is an award for scholars who are engaged in preserving the legacy of Polish Jewish history. He's also edited a book dealing with the issue of neighbors, which Professor Gross wrote, called The Neighbors, a Response, where he has an edited volume of collected essays responding to the important works of Professor.
And Jan Gross is currently the Norman B. Tomlinson class of 1916 and 1948 Professor of War and Society at Princeton University. Before then, he has taught also at other institutions. Before then, he was at NYU, New York University. He's also taught at Emory, at Yale, and various other universities in Europe. Jan Gross came to the United States from Poland, from Warsaw, in 1969, at a moment of political turmoil in Poland. And having lived in Poland, he thought that the best place to end up on the other side of the ocean was Yale. And he got then his PhD in sociology at Yale in 1975. His dissertation was then later published as a book, Polish Society Under German Occupation. It appeared in 1979 and was followed almost 10 years later by Revolution from Abroad. Now, these books in 1988, for a historian, I'm a historian of Russia, are really important books not only for the information they bring to bear, but for the way they are written. This is a sociologist writing about history. He has a conceptual framework, and they are parallel books. There are books about the two different occupations of Poland under the Stalin-Hitler Pact, and it's an analysis of how these powers impinge and penetrate on the society that they are occupying. So they are a pair, they're twins, and they're a remarkable intellectual achievement, in my opinion, and a model for historians. I don't want to speak for sociologists. Anyway, they're very stimulating, and they are not argumentative, they are thought-provoking. However, the piece of writing and scholarship that by Professor Gross that has been the most provoking and thought-provoking and politically provoking is his book called Neighbors, which appeared in 2001. And here he examines, instead of a broad conceptual problem, a microcosm, a case study, in this case the horrible event during World War II in which the Jews of a certain town, Litvak, were murdered collectively by their own Polish neighbors. And although this had been known locally, it was not alone, it was not really publicized in Poland. And the publication of this book in English and in Polish, and the debate that it aroused, really started a whole public discussion in Poland. And it is not every historian, least of all every academic historian, who can say that he or she has intervened in the public debate in a really productive and important and historical way. So Litvak, and I'm sure this will come up in the discussion, is itself a historical event. However, the book that provoked me or inspired me to invite him on this occasion is his second book on in a similar format. And this book appeared only this summer. It is called Fear. And in this book, Professor Gross examines another atrocity, this time after the war. This time, the first atrocity occurred under the aegis of the Germans occupying. Here we have...
The facts of what happened in Poland during the Second World War are clear. Poland was occupied by very brutal regimes, both from the east and the west, and the impact on Jewish life in Poland was disastrous. Of the 3.5 million Polish Jews on the eve of the Second World War, barely 350,000 survived the war. The rate of survival was lower than anywhere else except in the Baltic states. Now, it's clear that the primary responsibility the deaths of Jews in Poland during the war was caused by the Nazis, by the Nazi occupation, and by the brutal policy carried out by the Nazis, the implementation of the final solution. The reason that death camps were established in Poland was this was where the bulk of Jews were to be found. The reason why the major death camp was established in Oświęcim, in which most of the Jews who died were not only Polish Jews, but Hungarian and other Jews, was because this was a railway junction at the heart of the Nazi Europe. Nevertheless, although it's clear that the Nazis were overwhelmingly responsible for what happened to the Jews, this is not still a sense of Jewish grievance and a sense of on the side of the Jews that the Poles did not behave during the Second World War in a manner that was expected. Just to give one quotation here, Emanuel Ringelblum, the diarist who was organized at the underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they wrote a book on the Aryan side called Polish-Jewish Relations during the Second World War. He wrote that the Polish government, people and the government of the Republic of Poland were incapable of deflecting the Nazi steamroller from its anti-Jewish course. But the question is permissible whether the attitude of the Polish people befitted the enormity of the calamities that befell the country's citizens. Was it inevitable that the Jews needed to hear laughter from wild mobs resounding from the other side of the ghetto walls? Did they really have to prevail such blank indifference in the face of the greatest tragedy of all time? I could repeat such statements. These are essentially accusations, sense of grievance, which is very easily understood given the terrible situation in which the Jews found themselves. Polish responses to these accusations have taken two forms. On the one hand, there have been attempts to justify Polish behavior and apologies for the behavior of Poles during the period. The best example of apologetics, I think, is an article written some years ago, in 1987, by a veteran member of the opposition, Brandeis, in which essentially he argued that the situation of the Poles was such that they couldn't do significantly more in order to aid the Jews. The obvious example of the attempt to apologize for Polish behavior is the well-known essay written by young